Hello, dear friends. Welcome back to part 2 of this softly spoken read-through of British kings and queens from the Anglo-Saxons to the House of Windsor by Sandra Forty. Part 2 sees us start with Edmund Ironside from the House of Wessex, who unfortunately only reigned from April the 24th to November the 30th, 1016. Here's a Victorian image of Edmund Ironside, the King of Wessex. He gained his nickname Ironside for the way he repelled the Danish Viking invasion led by King Knut. He fought bravely, but ultimately without success, against the invading Danes, led by Knut, and succeeded as the designated heir to his older brother Aethelstan in 1014, but his father, King Ethelred, wanted Aethelstan's holdings for himself. To weaken his son's position, the king had two of his principal allies, Danish Earls Sigfrid and Morcar, executed, but Edmund retaliated by strengthening his claim by marrying Edith, Sigurd's widow, who'd been confined to a nunnery. Edmund then moved to the 5 boroughs of Stamford, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham and Derby, where the people all submitted to him. While all this family infighting was going on, the ambitious King Knut seized the opportunity to invade England with his armies that summer. In 1015, Edmund openly rebelled against his father, probably because he feared being passed over for his half-brothers Edward and Alfred in succession to the throne by allying with the Earl Uhtred of Northumbria, then devastated much of northwest Mercia. However, the Earl proved unreliable, quickly pledged his support for Knut instead, and in due course Knut repaid Uhtred by having him murdered. Left without support, Edmund reconciled with his desperately ill father who was lying sick in London. Harefoot didn't recover from illness, died on April the 23rd, 1016, at a time when Knut was proving his strength in England and was surrounding the city of London. Handed the reins of power by the people of London, Edmund was crowned King of England at St. Paul's Cathedral on April the 14th, 1016. He bravely attempted to defend his inheritance, but the Witan in Southampton chose Knut as their king. As the Danes besieged London, Edmund made haste for Wessex to raise an army to repel the invaders. When the Englishmen stood and fought, the Danes were driven back. Successful in battle, the Wessex army moved to raise the Danish siege of London, and then proceeded to repeatedly beat the Danes 5 times in battle, and the 6th at Ashington in Essex. On October the 18th, Knut scored a decisive victory, thanks to the treachery of Edric Stiona, an alderman of the Mercians, and Edmund's brother-in-law. The English were betrayed and then slaughtered, but Edmund escaped, though wounded, to Gloucestershire, who was reluctantly pressured into agreeing a peace through a lack of support from the Witan. The resulting Treaty of Olney in 1016, Edmund and Knut swore friendship and divided the kingdom. Legend says that Edmund invited Knut to single combat to limit the loss of life, but Knut declined on the grounds that the fight would be unfair because Edmund was so much bigger and stronger. Instead, they negotiated a peace treaty on an island in the middle of the River Severn in Gloucestershire. This resulted in Edmund retaining Essex and Knut taking all of the lands north of the River Thames, including the important city of London. The crucial clause was their pledge that whoever died first, the other would inherit their territories. On November the 30th, 1016, King Edmund died suddenly at the age of 26. He'd been King of England for only 8 months and left Knut as sole King of England. The cause of death is unknown, but it was probably from wounds sustained in battle, but could have been through treachery. He was buried at Glastonbury Abbey in Somerset, and his tomb was destroyed and lost during the dissolution of the monasteries in the mid-16th century. He fathered 2 children, Edward and Edmund. The boys were gathered up by King Knut and sent to Sweden, where they were supposed to be quietly dispatched. Instead, they were sent to Kiev in Russia, and then on to Hungary. Viking Knut was left then the undisputed King of England, and his accession ushered in a reign of stability and prosperity. So King Knut, the House of Denmark, 1016 to 1035. After a battle-strewn start, King Knut became a successful leader who turned England into a stable and prosperous land. He claimed to be king of all England and Denmark and the Norwegians and some of the Swedes, and at various times extended his reign to various now Scottish islands, parts of mainland Scotland, the Isle of Man and Dublin. He was the son of the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard and an unknown mother. Knut's birth date and place are also a mystery, little recorded until he accompanies his father on a successful invasion of England in the summer of 1013. As the Viking raiders marched inland, Knut was left in command of the fleet at Gainsborough, and in February 1014 Forkbeard died suddenly, leaving Knut as the heir to England and his eldest son Harold as king of Denmark. The English nobility didn't want to accept him, and at the Witan, the High Council, they voted for the return of the exiled Anglo-Saxon king Aethelred the Unready from Normandy. Knut returned with 200 longships and a Viking army of 10,000 men in summer 1015, and had the support of many European, mostly Scandinavian allies, and crucially the Earl of Mercia, Edric Stiona, probably the richest English nobleman. The Viking fleet quickly sailed down the east coast of England, through the English Channel, around the Cornish peninsula, and then up the Bristol Channel, all the way to Bristol, from where they landed and invaded inland into the heart of Wessex. This attack caught the English by surprise, and Aethelred was forced to retreat to London, as his country was invaded and conquered. Fortunes ebbed and flowed on both sides until eventually the decisive Battle of Ashington, in which Knut finally triumphed. As we learned previously, Edmund was cornered and decided upon a treaty. After his death, shortly after, Knut became king of all of England. Knut married Emma, Aethelred's widow, in July 1017, and the daughter of the Duke of Normandy. Their son, Harthacnut, was declared heir to the throne, rather than Knut's previous sons by an earlier marriage. Harthacnut was sent to Denmark, where he was brought up as a Viking prince. Here we have King Knut and Queen Emma, Knut's second wife. The most famous story about King Knut concerns the sea. Many of his fawning courtiers eulogized Knut, claiming he could do anything. In frustration, and to prove his fallibility, he ordered his throne set up on the beach of Bosham, from where he commanded the waves. "Go back, sea." But the sea still advanced, and his feet got wet. But he had made his point to his followers, and is quoted as saying, "Let all men know how empty and worthless is the power of kings, for there is none worthy of the name but God, whom heaven, earth, and sea obey." Constitutionally, Knut divided England into 4 great earldoms, Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria, and revived many of the earlier English laws to establish order and justice across the land, and ordered that the coinage be aligned with that of Denmark to the benefit of trade and governance of both countries. Viking raiders stopped attacking England, allowing the country an unprecedented era of stability and prosperity. The last Geld, £82,500, was paid to Knut in 1018, and much of his Viking army was allowed to return home to Scandinavia with a handsome payoff. Knut respected and upheld the teachings of the church, which in turn supported him. He repaired damaged churches and monasteries and built new ones. He even journeyed to Rome to meet the Pope and be present at the coronation of the new Holy Roman Emperor, whom he stood beside as an equal. In 1018, Knut's brother Harold of Denmark died, and Knut travelled to Denmark to claim the throne. While abroad, he used trusted and powerful earls to run the government. In 1028, Knut took a fleet of 50 ships to conquer Norway, where he was crowned king of Trondheim. He died in Shaftesbury, Dorset in November 1035, aged about 40, and was buried in Winchester. So he was succeeded by his son Harold Harefoot, and became regent of England with Emma of Normandy, Harthacnut's mother, in 1035 to represent his younger half-brother, as the latter were embroiled in repelling invaders in Denmark. Harold became King of England in 1037 by popular acclaim when Emma fled to Flanders, and he was crowned at Oxford. A year earlier, Edgar the Atheling and his brother Edward, later the Confessor, returned from Normandy, ostensibly to visit their mother Emma in Winchester. Suspicious of their motives, Harold had Alfred captured and blinded. He died soon after of his wounds. Harold died aged 24 in March 1040 after ruling for 4 years and 16 weeks, just as Harthacnut's invasion fleet was on its way to England. then have the reign of Harthacnut. Lasted 2 years, 1040 to 1042. His invasion force of around 62 warships was en route for England when Harold Harefoot died, so Harthacnut was accepted as king uncontested, and after his coronation at Canterbury, he had Harold's body violated and flung into a marsh, and imposed the punitive fleet tax to pay for his invasion costs on the English for accepting Harold as their king. A very unpopular monarch, Harthacnut died aged 24 during a drinking session after a wedding feast in Lambeth. We've all been there. Here is an image of St. Edward the Confessor celebrating Easter in 1053. So the penultimate Anglo-Saxon king of England was unable to unite his kingdom behind him, thanks to his perceived favoritism towards his Norman advisors. This unpopularity allowed the wealth and strength of 3 powerful earls, Godwin, Leofric, and Seward, to grow. When Edward died without producing an heir, the kingdom was left to prey to powerful and ambitious suitors. So Edward was the youngest son of Ethelred the Unready and Emma of Normandy, but following the Danish invasion of England by Knut in 1013, he and his brother Alfred were sent to live with their Norman cousins. There, the harsh childhood and strict religious upbringing influenced his life. Edward was recalled to England by his half-brother Harthacnut, the new king in 1041, and in turn took the throne when Harthacnut died in 1042, allegedly following a serious drinking session. In April 1043, Edward was crowned in Winchester Cathedral as the new king to popular acclaim. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states that one of his first decisions was to remove all of his mother's estates, so reducing her to relative poverty in retaliation for the miserable childhood she endorsed, that and her support for Magnus I of Norway for the throne of England. For diplomatic reasons, Edward married Edith, daughter of Godwin of Essex, the most powerful nobleman in the land. But the marriage proved childless, and some years later in 1051, a number of important Normans were killed during a fight in the port of Dover. Anxious to placate his powerful Norman relatives and allies, Edward ordered his father-in-law, Earl Godwin, to punish the people of Dover. Godwin refused and instead gathered an army to oppose Edward, but the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria remained loyal to him, so Godwin fled to his relatives in Flanders instead. Edward chose to surround himself with Norman courtiers and advisors, much to the annoyance of the Anglo-Saxon nobility. This unpopularity encouraged Earl Godwin to gather an invading army commanded by his sons Tonstig and Harold, and returned to England in 1052. By this time, Edward was now so lacking in support he was unable to raise an army and had to treat with Godwin. His Norman advisors were sent back to Normandy, and Godwin was pardoned for his rebellion and restored to all his lands and titles. The following year, Godwin died to be succeeded by his son Harold, who now became the most powerful noble in the land. Edward never fully regained his people's faith and support, but he'd learned to listen to the Witan. Duly chastised, he put all of his energies into building Westminster Abbey in London, and when his army needed a leader, he appointed Harold. In January 1066, Edward the Confessor died in his early 60s on January the 5th, 1066, and Harold Godwinson became king. Edward was buried in Westminster Abbey and canonized in 1161. From the mid-12th century until 1348, he was the patron saint of England. Didn't know that. We now have Harold Godwinson, January the 5th to October 14th, 1066. A famous date, of course, in history, as we have the medieval representation of his death here with the arrow in the eye and the Bayeux tapestry depicting the arrow that struck him. So he was only king for 10 months. He's an important figure in English history, because after him, the crown passed into unpopular foreign Norman hands, and the Anglo-Saxons became oppressed in their own land. He was the second son of the powerful Earl Godwin of Wessex and his wife Gaitha, and while still a child in 1044, he became the Earl of East Anglia, and then as a young man in 1051 shared his father's banishment, but went with his brother Leofwine to Ireland. Edward the Confessor and Harold reached an accord. Harold became his principal advisor, and although the pair were hardly close, in 1055 when the Welsh came and burned Harefoot, Harold was at the head of the army. Then in 1063, together with his brother Tausig, he campaigned in the Great Welsh War and crushed Griffith ap Llywelyn of Gwynedd, the Conqueror of Wales, who was subsequently murdered by his own followers. When Seward of Northumberland died in 1055, Tausig was given the earldom, but within 10 years the locals had rebelled against him and installed Morkier instead. Harold was sent as mediator and negotiated a peace which confirmed Morkier and banished Tausig. In 1064, one of the great controversies of English history may or may not have occurred. According to Norman sources, Harold was shipwrecked off Normandy and was captured by Guy I, Duke of Ponthieu. When Duke William heard about the prisoner, he demanded that he was handed over to him, and then demanded that Harold swear allegiance to him, and personally, that he support his claim to the throne of England. Norman sources also claim that Harold was journeying to see Duke William, as he had been charged by Edward the Confessor to tell him that he was his appointed heir to the throne of England. None of this is supported by Anglo-Saxon sources. Edward appointed Harold as his successor on his deathbed and was crowned king in Westminster Abbey, but his rivals had their own ambitions. Between May and September, Harold's armies fought off invasions by land and sea, and from the southeast, William of Normandy demanded the crown, saying Edward had nominated him, and that Harold himself had pledged support to him. From the north, Tostig appeared and attacked the Isle of Wight, but was forced to flee to Scotland. However, as fall arrived, Harold ran out of money and provisions, and the land army was dispersed back to their homes. Harold moved to London and was prepared to fight. His brother Tostig now arrived with Harold III of Norway, and together they sailed up the River Humber and took the city of York. Harold and his army rushed north, and on September the 25th the two armies met at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Harold was victorious, and both Tostig and Harold III were killed in battle. Duke William of Normandy seized his opportunity and a prevailing wind and set sail for England. He landed at Pevensey, and Harold, on receiving the news, gathered as many of his men as possible, bar the northerners who remained to protect their lands, and marched south to London, where the call went out for men all over southern and eastern England to gather. Then a week later, with the hastily gathered troops, he marched south to Sussex, where the Battle of Hastings took place. The fighting started on the morning of October the 14th, 1066, and lasted through the day, until by the evening the Normans were victorious. Harold and his brothers Leofwine and Gyrth died in the fighting. The last Anglo-Saxon king of England was dead. Harold had married twice, initially in a Nordic marriage, not sanctioned by the church, to Edelgith Swanneck, and together they had at least 4 children. And in January 1066, he married Edith, the daughter of the Earl of Mercia, a widow of Griffith ap Llywelyn of Gwynedd, whom he had defeated in 1063. She bore him twin boys, Harold and Ulf, after their father died. What became of the Queen and her sons are unknown, but they probably fled into exile where they lived out the remainder of their lives. And of course, there are regular reenactments of the Battle of Hastings. This led on to Edgar the Atheling, who was the last English heir to the English throne, born in Hungary, the grandson of King Edmund II and son of Edward the Exile. He was proclaimed king, but never crowned. Edgar was too young to take the throne, so Howard Godwinson, the Confessor's brother-in-law, took the throne instead, who might have been King Edward's choice anyway. When Harold died at the Battle of Hastings, Edgar was proclaimed king by the Witan at the age of around 14, but there was no army, or indeed any military support to reinforce that position. Within 8 weeks, he was captured and taken to Berkhamsted to submit to William the Conqueror. King William recognised Edgar's importance and eventually shipped him to Normandy, and in 1068 he escaped to Scotland, where King Malcolm III gave him shelter and support. For the rest of his life he made repeated but futile attempts to regain his crown, and in 1098 went to the rescue of the First Crusade by taking reinforcements to the Crusaders at the siege of Antioch. He was eventually pardoned by King Henry I and allowed to live on his estate in Hertfordshire. It's thought he lived until his early 70s. But here we have King William, as per the Bayeux Tapestry, King William the Conqueror. Guillaume le Bâtard, or William the Bastard, was the illegitimate and only son of Duke Robert I of Normandy and Airlieve, the daughter of a tanner from Falaise, where William was born. Most unusually, William was recognised as his father's heir on his death in 1035. Children born out of wedlock were almost always barred from inheriting. While still a child, he was 8 when he inherited. His great-uncle looked after the Duchy of Normandy, and King Henri of France knighted him at the age of 15. Normandy was a powerful and rebellious duchy, and a real rival for the King of France, and a target for ambitious men. The Normans were extremely warlike, and raised their children in strict martial tradition, so they were born to fight. So William grew up to be a successful commander with a fearsome reputation, who unified his lands despite many attacks on them. In 1053 he made an important dynastic marriage to his distant cousin Matilda, the daughter of Count Baldwin V of Flanders, and together they had 4 sons and 6 daughters. Normandy wasn't big enough for his ambition, though. He wanted to be King of England, and founded his claim through being the grandnephew of Queen Emma of Normandy, the wife of both Ethelred the Unready and King Knut. He insisted that his distant cousin, Edward the Confessor, had made him heir in 1052, and Harold had sworn to support his claim to the throne. So Harold was basically a usurper. In this he was endorsed by Pope Alexander II and Emperor Henry IV. So for 7 months William laid his plans and prepared his fleet. The cross-channel invasion force consisted of around 600 ships that would carry some 3,000 cavalrymen and their horses and 4,000 infantrymen. When they were ready, all they had to do was wait for a favourable wind, which finally blew in on September the 28th. The invasion landed unopposed at Pevensey Bay, and within a few days, with ruthless Norman efficiency, they'd made fortifications at Hastings in Sussex. His rival 2 days earlier, Harold, had won a stunning victory at Stamford Bridge against Tostig and the King of Norway in the far north of England, near York. With barely time to catch his breath, he had to turn his army round and march back south to repel the Norman invasion. The army marched down to London, where they regrouped for a week, recruited reinforcements, and within 9 days were ready for battle in Sussex. The 2 armies met at Senlac on October the 14th. Harold's veteran troops comprised the best infantry in Europe, but were weary from the forced march and bulked out with inexperienced soldiers. Facing them was an equal-sized army comprising Norman cavalry and archers. It lasted from morning till night, with the Normans attacking and the English defending. No sign gained an advantage. It said that 3 horses were killed under Duke William during the day. In one of the final attacks, Harold was killed. His 2 brothers also died, and at dusk, and without their leader, the English troops panicked and fled, leaving the Normans victorious. And instead of submitting to the inevitable, the Witan proclaimed Edgar Atheling King of England, leaving William no choice but to march on London. He was initially repelled, but until he met Edgar and received his submission at Buckhampstead. On Christmas Day 1066, William I was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey, and for the next 6 years battled to conquer England itself and to maintain his iron grip on Normandy. French became the language of the nobility, and he introduced the Norman feudal system to England, whereby every man in the land was pledged on pain of death to support his social superior, all the way up to the king. Here is his statue at Falaise in Normandy, where he was born. Uprisings were ruthlessly put down, with the help of newly appointed earls who were given land in return for fighting to enforce the Norman conquest. The English nobility had their lands and wealth confiscated and reallocated to loyal Norman nobles, and the Danes were repelled and the northern nobles subjugated in Mercia and Northumbria. Agricultural land was laid waste, creating a famine which lasted some 9 years or so. He invaded Scotland in 1072 and established a peace, and in 1081 did much the same in Wales. The last serious English rebellion was the revolt of the Earls in 1075. So to reinforce the Norman dominance over the land, William started an extensive program of castle building. Over 80 had been built by the time of his death, and many of these had private armies to defend them. Additionally, half of England's landed wealth by then belonged to a favoured few Normans, and only 2 English noblemen had retained their estates. So England became a closely administered and controlled land, but all of this fighting and building cost huge amounts of money, so William ordered a thorough investigation of the exact holdings of each of his feudal tenants. The resulting 2-volume Domesday Book of 1086 was compiled within a remarkably short time, given the complexity of its requirements. From these records, William could immediately see who owned what, where, and most importantly, the fealty and tax owed to the crown. Once England was completely subjugated, William left the country to be ruled by regents while he defended Normandy against the ambitions of the French king. In fact, he spent much of his last 15 years in Normandy, finally dying there on September the 9th, 1087, from his injuries he sustained when he fell off his horse during the Battle of Mons. Before his death, he divided his kingdom between his sons. Normandy went to the eldest, Robert, and England to William Rufus. His third son, Henry, was given £5,000 in silver. William was buried in the abbey he founded, St. Stephen at Caen. So William II was named Rufus for his ruddy complexion as shown here, and was the third and favourite son of William I and Matilda of Flanders, born in Normandy before his father conquered England and ruled from 1087 to 1100. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, admittedly a very biased record, labelled him as being hated by almost all his people, and all weird probability he hated his English subjects every bit as much, but very little is known about his early life. But he was almost certainly brought up in the harsh environs of the Norman court with its martial attitudes and strictures. When William I died in 1087, he became King of England. He was crowned by Lanfranc, Archbishop of Canterbury, on September the 26th, 1087, and in the following year faced a short-lived rebellion led by his uncle Bishop Odo of Bayeux to force the English crown into Duke Robert's hands, but the latter was unwilling to fight in England, and the English nobles instead supported William. The cause was initially supported by the Norman nobles, who had lands on both sides of the Channel, and supposed their fortunes would prosper under one ruler. In 1089, William announced his intention to claim Normandy, and in 1091 invaded it and forced Robert to submit to him. To occupy his time, Robert went on the First Crusade in 1096 and mortgaged Normandy to William for 10,000 marks. William raised the money by imposing a heavy tax on his resentful English subjects. When King Malcolm III of Scotland attempted to invade northern England in 1091, he was compelled to submit to William instead at the Firth of Forth. He was attempted to rebel again in November 1093, but his army was beaten near Alnwick and Malcolm was killed. From then on, the Scottish kings were Norman vassals. His relations with the church were never cordial. They disapproved of his lifestyle and court, and particularly of using church revenues for himself if he kept the bishoprics vacant. When the archbishops of Canterbury and Anselm of Bec fled to Europe, Rome and Pope Urban II and William seized his estates. The Pope and William reached an accord which politically suited them both, and William pocketed the revenues of the Archbishop of Canterbury for the remainder of his reign. On the 2nd of August 1110, he was hunting around Brockenhurst in the New Forest in Hampshire when he was shot by an arrow through the lung. It may have been an assassination, and the perpetrators may have been Walter Tyrrell, Lord of Poy. The two were alone at the time of William's death, acting on the orders of William's younger brother Henry Beauclerc, who quickly claimed the throne as Henry I. William II had not married or produced any known children, buried in Winchester Cathedral in Hampshire. So we have more backstabbings and assassinations leading on to the role of Henri I Beauclerc, a Victorian image of him here. And below, Henry I dreams about discontented peasants and angry barons. The fourth and youngest son of William I and Queen Matilda was born in Selby in Yorkshire, probably destined for the church until fate intervened. He was possibly the first Norman king to be fluent in English, and when his brother William II died in a hunting accident, Henry acted quickly. His older brother Robert, Duke of Normandy, was away on the First Crusade, so Henry seized the royal treasury at Winchester and buried his brother there, and then had himself crowned 3 days later at Westminster Abbey. He bought the support of the influential barons by granting them huge favours, abolishing a number of abuses, and granting a large range of concessions in the Charter of Liberties. And to secure the northern border against invasion, he married Edith, the daughter of Malcolm III, King of Scotland, and she was descended from Edward the Confessor, so the marriage united the old English line of kings with the Norman newcomers, which was popular with his Anglo-Saxon subjects. But the marriage was unpopular with the Norman barons, and Edith soon changed their name to Matilda to temper their feelings. In 1101, Robert invaded England, but the brothers quickly reached a settlement in the Treaty of Alton. In return for relinquishing his claim to England, Robert received Henry's Norman lands plus 2,000 silver marks annually. But Robert was a poor leader, and Henry used the excuse to invade Normandy in 1106, where he triumphed at the Battle of Tinchebray. Robert was captured and held prisoner in the Tower of London, Devizes Castle, and Cardiff until his death 28 years later. Because of his dual territories, Henry was frequently absent from England, so to maintain good governance in his absence and raise crucial revenues, he created an efficient centralised bureaucracy and also restored the laws of Edward the Confessor. The Exchequer was established to look after and raise royal moneys, and a royal justice system put in place which taught the land to enforce local administration by investigating corruption and to raise revenues. To keep his Norman possession, Henry had to fight off the resentful barons, but their threat had disappeared by 1120. By 1113, Henry betrothed his only legitimate son, William Adelin, to the daughter of his powerful enemy, Fulk, Count of Anjou. They married in 1119. However, William was drowned in the shipwreck of the White Ship in the English Channel in 1120, throwing the succession to the crown into turmoil. Henry responded by summoning Matilda, widow of Holy Roman Emperor Henry V, and his only living legitimate child, back to England. He insisted his barons pledge their allegiance to her as his heir, and to strengthen her position, in 1128 she was married to her cousin Geoffrey Plantagenet, the son of Fulk V, Count of Anjou. Queen Matilda had died in 1118, and in January 1121 Henry married for a second time in an attempt to father a legitimate male successor. His wife was Adeliza, daughter of Godfrey of Leuven, but their union was childless. Throughout his life, Henry had many mistresses and up to 25 illegitimate children. Many of them were ennobled, but Henry made it clear they would never inherit his lands or crown. He died from a surfeit of Lambries on December 1st, 1135, in Saint-Denis and Lyon, Normandy, aged about 67, while visiting his daughter Matilda, her husband and children. His body was returned to England for burial at Reading Abbey in Berkshire. He was succeeded by Stephen, House of Normandy, 1135 to 1154 reign, and the last Norman king of England. Stephen of Blois was born in Blois, France, the son of the Count of Blois and Adela, daughter of William the Conqueror, but was raised at the court of his uncle Henry I in England. When he died, leaving his daughter Matilda as heir, many of the barons were unhappy at having a female monarch, even though they had pledged to support her, and instead the majority of the barons declared Stephen king, possibly because they knew he was a weak man who they could control, whereas Matilda was a strong woman they couldn't. Pope Innocent II also supported Stephen. Furthermore, Stephen claimed that Henry had named him successor on his deathbed. Here he is being crowned on December 26, 1135. In 1139, England was plunged into the Anarchy, a period of civil war that started when Matilda's half-brother, Robert the Earl of Gloucester, fought on her behalf. Initially, Stephen's armies won many of the battles, but in September 1139, Matilda invaded England and took control of western England. 2 years later, in spring 1141, Stephen was defeated and captured in battle at Lincoln. He was imprisoned in Bristol until November that year, when he was exchanged for the captured Earl of Gloucester. In his absence, Stephen's wife, also called Matilda, had rallied support from the barons and from Londoners. Gradually, Stephen's forces prevailed until in 1148 Matilda left England altogether. In such times of unrest, the barons consolidated personal control of their territories and areas of influence, and Stephen had little power over his land or nobles. He intended to leave the throne to his son Eustace, but he died on 1153, and although he still had a living son in William of Blois, Stephen reluctantly agreed to hand the succession to Matilda's son Henry, as stipulated in the Treaty of Wallingford. Stephen died in October 1154 at Dover Priory in Kent, and was buried at Faversham Abbey. Joined his wife Matilda, daughter of the Count of Boulogne, whom he had married around 1125. She had died in 1152 and was buried in the abbey she and her husband had founded. This then brings us on to a huge house of Plantagenet that many are descended from to this day. But I think that marks an appropriate point to end our journey, to begin the third part soon of the kings and queens of Britain. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to having you here next time. Until then, goodbye.